In the blistering heat of a Mesopotamian noon, under the relentless gaze of Shamash, the sun god, there stood a wooden platform raised above the dust-choked streets of Babylon. It was not a stage for performance, nor a pulpit for prophets. It was a place of punishment. The crowd had gathered as they always did when the whip cracked or the iron was heated in the fires. Punishment in ancient times was not simply retribution, it was ritual, a sacred theater where the gods looked on and men were reduced to ash and scream. Today, a man named Iltani was brought before the high priest. Iltani had stolen grain, not a bag, not even enough to feed a household, but he had stolen from the temple granary. In the code of Hammurabi, such an offense was not forgivable. The temple was sacred. Stealing from the gods was a sin worthy of unmaking. 2 guards stripped him bare, chaining his wrists to the beams. The high priest, cloaked in ceremonial feathers and bronze talismans, lifted his hand. A silence fell over the plaza. "We offer flesh to restore order," he proclaimed. "Blood to cleanse the impure, pain to please the gods." They brought out the Flaying Wheel. Crafted of cedar and iron, the wheel was an archaic invention, rotating not to crush, but to stretch. Iltani's limbs were tied, then slowly pulled apart, not to the point of death, but the brink. Then came the knives. Slivers of skin were removed with agonizing precision. There was no mercy, for mercy was not divine. The priest began to chant. It was said that the screams of the punished rose through the heavens like incense. But Babylon was not alone in its brutality. Centuries later, in the jagged mountains of Anatolia, the Hittite kings devised a punishment for traitors that was as symbolic as it was horrific. The accused was named Tarhuna, a commander who had led men into battle only to betray them to a rival tribe. When he was caught, the court did not sentence him to death, at least not in the traditional sense. Instead, they performed the bronze thirst. A large copper vessel was filled with coarse salt and placed under the summer sun until it glowed with heat. The condemned would be made to drink nothing but brine for 2 days. Then they were bound in a chamber with salted walls, and their feet were forced into red-hot iron boots lined with more salt. The salt seeped into the pores. It burned into the skin like fire. But the final part was worse. A tube was inserted into the man's throat, through which honey was slowly poured. More was smeared on his face. He was then taken to the edge of the royal city and left on a pedestal near the marshes. Within hours, insects had gathered. Flies, wasps, ants, and beetles swarmed over him. Over the course of 3 days, his skin became a hive and his body a banquet. He was eaten alive, internally and externally. It was said that the honey preserved his corpse, and his eyes remained open long after death. The ancient Egyptians, known for their wisdom and monuments, were not exempt from divine cruelty. In the reign of Pharaoh Seti I, a noble named Nebamun was convicted of conspiracy, plotting to defile the sacred tombs of the Valley of the Kings. Desecrating the dead was one of the greatest crimes in Egyptian law, for it threatened the balance of Ma'at, the universal harmony. His sentence was the mouth of the crocodile. Nebamun was gagged, bound, and placed in a cage made of reed and limestone. He was dragged by boat deep into the Nile Delta, where the priests believed the gods of the underworld lingered. There, an ancient temple stood in ruins, dedicated not to Osiris or Horus, but to Sobek, the crocodile god of chaos and retribution. The priests placed an offering at the edge of the river, Nebamun himself. The cage was slowly lowered into the water, where dozens of crocodiles waited. The high priest whispered incantations, not for protection, but to awaken Sobek's wrath. The cage tilted. There was a moment of silence, then thrashing water. The guards said they heard nothing but the snapping of jaws and gurgled cries. But the next morning they returned to find the cage untouched, except for a single hand gripping the bars, its fingers clenched in agony. The rest of Nebamun was gone. Across the world, on the island of Crete, long before the rise of classical Greece, the Minoans practiced a peculiar punishment for sacrilege. Their society was deeply religious, structured around matriarchal rituals and lunar worship. When a young priestess named Althea was caught defiling the sacred Labyrinth, a double-headed axe believed to channel divine will, she was taken to the Cavern of Echoes. This cave, hidden beneath the palace of Knossos, was said to be where the gods first whispered the secrets of life and death. Its walls were slick with mineral deposits, and the air was thick with the scent of bat guano and old bones. Althea was not tortured in the traditional sense. She was left to hear. Chained naked in the pitch dark, she was forced to endure silence for days until the whispers began. The Minoans believed that guilt had a sound. The cave would echo your crimes, and eventually you would hear them. Althea screamed, begged, and eventually whispered back. She began to chant strange phrases, unknown even to the priestesses. When they finally opened the cavern weeks later, her hair had turned white, her nails had grown into claws, and she had carved symbols into the stone with her teeth. They say she walked into the sea that night, murmuring to someone only she could hear. In the dense jungles of ancient India, under the rule of the Maurya Empire, punishment took on a spiritual and philosophical shape. Crime was not merely an offense against the state, but a deviation from Dharma, the cosmic order. For some transgressions, prison was not enough. Pain had to be purifying. One such punishment was known only as the Lotus Ritual. A monk named Ashvaka was accused of defiling a sacred relic, touching it with unclean hands during a time of mourning. Witnesses said it was an accident, but the elders disagreed. The relic was the tooth of the Buddha, a fragment of divine presence. To contaminate it was to break the chain of enlightenment. Ashvaka was taken to the Temple of Eternal Stillness, located in the shadow of a dormant volcano. There he was made to sit cross-legged atop a wooden platform shaped like a blooming lotus. Beneath each petal, hidden from view, were sharpened bamboo spikes tipped with chili oil and snake venom. As the monks chanted, ropes slowly tightened from above, forcing his body downward. Every inch he descended, the spikes pierced deeper, not enough to kill, but enough to invoke transcendental agony. The ritual lasted 12 hours. By the end, his body had formed a perfect lotus shape, arms folded, legs bent, eyes wide open. They left him in that position, preserved with herbal paste, displayed as a warning and a martyr.
Some monks whispered that on certain nights his statue weeps blood from the eyes. In the frigid wastelands of Scythia, where nomadic tribes ruled on horseback and the wind carried death like perfume, a different kind of punishment awaited those who broke the unspoken code of blood loyalty. One such soul was a warrior named Kurgan, who abandoned his clan during battle. For this, he was sentenced to the bone thirst. Kurgan was stripped of armor, his weapons shattered, and his hands broken with hammers. But he was not to die quickly. The shamans believed in soul starvation, a process by which the spirit is drained through prolonged suffering. They placed him in a stone pit, dug so deep that no sunlight reached the bottom. The floor was lined with the bones of others who had met the same fate. Then they poured a thick liquid, milk, mixed with horse blood over his body. Not to feed, but to rot. The real punishment began after 3 days. Rats were lowered into the pit, not ordinary ones, but desert rats, known for chewing through bone when starved. They were released hungry and frenzied. The smell of milk and blood drove them insane. For hours, Kurgan screamed. The tribe said nothing. They listened from above, and when the screams finally stopped, they sealed the pit with obsidian slabs. Later, a warrior claimed to hear scratching beneath his tent. He opened the earth and found only teeth, human and rat, fused in impossible ways. Further west, in the dark forests of Germania, before the Romans ever dared to conquer the tribes, a unique punishment was reserved for oath-breakers, the hanging stone. In one of the scattered villages along the Rhine, a chieftain's son betrayed his people by revealing sacred burial grounds to outsiders. For this, he was brought to the stone circle, an ancient formation believed to predate even the gods. The punishment was simple in design, but devastating in execution. A massive slab of granite, shaped like a human heart, was tied to the chest of the condemned with twisted animal sinew. Then, he was hung from the tallest oak in the circle, not by the neck, but by the shoulders, forcing the stone to drag his chest downward while the ropes pulled his arms upward. Over hours, the shoulders dislocated. The sternum cracked. Blood pooled in the lungs. The forest listened. The Druids recorded the event in symbols carved onto bark, believing that pain fed the spirit world and kept the seasons turning. Centuries later, when Roman soldiers cut through the area, they found a skeleton still hanging. Arms torn from their sockets, chest crushed inward, heart-shaped stone cracked in half. One soldier reportedly died on the spot. Another went mute forever. In the northern reaches of ancient China, during the cruel and iron-fisted Qin dynasty, Emperor Qin Shi Huang's secret police enforced his will with methods known only in whispers. One such method was the mirror cage. A scholar named Wei Ju was arrested for writing a forbidden poem. It was not seditious in tone, but its lines questioned the immortality of the emperor. For this, he was erased, not from existence, but from his own mind. He was taken to a chamber deep beneath Xianyang, lined with polished bronze mirrors. The mirrors were angled so that no matter where he looked, he saw himself. But not just himself, a distorted version. Each reflection was slightly off, one older, one missing eyes, one with a bleeding mouth, one smiling. For days, Wei Ju was denied food, given only bitter tea laced with herbs that induced hallucinations. He began speaking to the reflections, then arguing, then screaming. On the 11th day, he was found lying in the center of the chamber, eyes gouged out, mouth stitched shut by his own hands using threads from his robe. The emperor called it a victory of order over chaos. The room was sealed, but local legend claims that if you enter with a single candle, you'll see not your own reflection, but Wei Ju's, watching you from behind. In the high deserts of the Inca Empire, where the sun was both a giver and taker of life, the priests devised a punishment so celestial it was almost beautiful: the condor's embrace. A young noblewoman, Amaru, was accused of betraying the sun god by practicing forbidden moon rituals. Her punishment was to be sent to the skies. She was taken to a mountain peak over 16,000 feet above sea level, where the air thinned and the gods were believed to walk among the clouds. There, she was bound to a sacred totem carved from obsidian and gold, her arms outstretched like wings. Feathers were glued to her skin with resin, and golden discs were placed over her eyes so she would see only the light. Then they waited. Condors began to circle, giant birds with wingspans wider than a man is tall. It is said that the Incas trained these birds with blood, taught them to associate the gleam of gold with the promise of meat. On the third day, the condors descended. They pecked, clawed, and tore, removing flesh in ceremonial patterns, guided not by instinct, but by ritual. When they were done, Amaru's bones remained polished and clean, arranged in a perfect circle of white among the clouds. The priests declared it a holy communion between earth and sky. Deep within the heart of the Aztec Empire, where stone pyramids pierced the heavens and rivers ran red with sacrifice, justice was not just divine, it was cosmic. The gods required balance, and blood was the currency of harmony. Among the most feared punishments was the heart tether. In Tenochtitlan, a warrior named Itzcoatl was found guilty of speaking the true name of Huitzilopochtli during an eclipse, a name believed to shatter the boundary between life and death. For this transgression, even death by blade was too merciful. Instead, he was bound atop the Tzompantli, the great skull rack. A shaman carved open his chest, but did not remove the heart. Instead, they left it exposed, still beating, protected by an obsidian cage. Through a sacred ritual, they tethered his heart to a hawk, tying a line of golden thread from vein to talon, blood to sky. The hawk was released. It flew, circling above, pulling gently on the thread, stretching flesh with every beat of the wings. As the heart pumped harder, the tether pulled tighter. The hawk soared higher and higher until the blood veins snapped and the exposed organ burst within his chest. The crowd cheered, not for cruelty, but for the belief that the gods had accepted the offering and woven it into the tapestry of the sun. Some say during eclipses, hawks can still be seen circling above the ruins, hunting hearts that dare to remember. In the dusty outskirts of Persia, during the reign of Darius the Great, a punishment existed that whispered through the empire like a sandstorm. It was reserved for the most insidious traitors, those who betrayed not men but memory. This punishment was known as the 1,000 Tongues. A scribe named Ardashir had been caught falsifying royal decrees. Not for money or power, but for revenge. His family had been slain by corrupt governors, and he sought to bend the law itself. The court ruled he had twisted the truth too deeply, and thus he would be unmade by the very words he once worshipped. He was taken to the Hall of Ashes, where scrolls were burned and voices forgotten. There, artisans carved thousands of tiny wooden tongues, each dipped in resin and engraved with a sacred syllable. These were not simply symbols, but curses, meant to confuse the spirit and fragment identity. One by one, the tongues were forced into Ardashir's flesh, under skin, beneath fingernails, inside his mouth. His own tongue was removed and replaced with a scroll soaked in blood and bound with hair. He did not die for days. Each time he tried to scream, the tongues within him shuddered, whispering in languages no one understood. By the time death took him, his body had become a library of agony. Later, it was said that if you stood near his tomb and recited his name backward, the air would buzz, not with sound, but with the sensation of too many voices speaking at once. Far east, on the volcanic isles of ancient Japan, long before the rise of the shogunate, tribal leaders believed that death must reflect the crime. To steal honor was to lose one's reflection in this world and the next. One punishment, rare but legendary, was called the Glass Ocean. A samurai named Kenjiro had murdered a sacred crane, an act believed to sever his soul from the cycle of rebirth. But execution was not immediate. Instead, his punishment was to be both seen and unseen. He was stripped and blindfolded, then led to the edge of a glassy volcanic lake known as Yurei no Mizu, the spirit's water. There, dozens of slaves had poured molten obsidian into shallow pools, creating giant mirror-like plates across the surface. Kenjiro was forced to walk across these glass sheets, barefoot and bleeding, for 7 days. He was not allowed to speak. If he fell, the punishment would reset. By the 5th day, his feet were shredded, his eyes swollen shut from weeping, but he continued. On the 7th day, he collapsed on the final slab. The monks etched his outline into the glass, using his blood as ink. They say that when the moon is full, Kenjiro's image still walks across the lake, one foot always lifting, never touching down. In the lands of Nubia, south of the Nile, where black stone temples rose like teeth from the earth, there existed a punishment as poetic as it was terrifying. It was called the Shadow Split. A princess named Makeda had defied her royal duties by marrying a foreign soldier. Though the king loved her, tradition demanded retribution, not for the marriage, but for the shame of secrecy.
Makeda was summoned to the Temple of Dual Suns. There, at dawn and dusk, 2 immense mirrors were placed opposite each other. The condemned would stand between them, casting twin shadows, one to the rising sun, the other to the setting. The priests would then pour black resin over her feet, rooting her to the stone. Over the next 10 hours, the sun would move, and the shadows would shift, stretching, twisting, eventually splitting from her body. At the moment when neither shadow aligned, the high priest would whisper a single command: return. It was believed that the soul followed the shadow. If it lost its reflection, it would wander forever. Makita's body remained, but her eyes turned to stone, her breath ceased, and her shadow never returned. Even now at that temple, one can stand at noon and cast no shadow, as if the land remembers her sin more than her life. In the ice-buried cities of the early Norse settlements, long before the sagas were written, justice was delivered through elemental suffering. One of the most feared punishments was the Frostbinding. A young warrior named Eirik betrayed his blood brother during a raid, leaving him for dead in enemy territory. The clan, outraged, demanded a punishment that would echo through all 9 worlds. Eirik was chained to a dead tree in the heart of a glacier known as Blodfjell, the Blood Mountain. There, ancient runes were carved into the ice, summoning the spirits of wind and storm. The punishment had 3 stages. First, his skin was scraped clean with volcanic glass, exposing every nerve to the biting air. Second, water from a sacred spring was poured over his body, freezing instantly and forming a crystalline shell. Finally, a wolf pelt soaked in blood was tied around his chest, attracting the spirits of hunger, both animal and divine. Eirik remained alive for 5 days. On the 6th, the ice cracked not from temperature, but from screaming, a howling not quite human, not quite wind. When the clan returned, only the tree remained, wrapped in ice, bleeding, and weeping. In the parched lands of Carthage, where incense and fire met the salt winds of the Mediterranean, punishment was both a public act and a private damnation. Among the worst was the ritual known only to the high priests of Tanit and Baal Hammon, the clay womb. A merchant named Zimrani was convicted of blasphemy after mocking a sacred fertility rite during a festival. He had poured wine on a clay idol, laughing at its barrenness. To insult life was to deny the god's favor, a crime worthy of spiritual abortion. Zimrani was taken to the temple of birth and death, where clay was not just building material, but sacred flesh. There, artisans molded a hollow statue of a pregnant woman, larger than a man, wide-bellied, mouth sealed, eyes blind. Naked and covered in sacred oil, Zimrani was folded inside the belly of the idol. Priests sang songs of life reversed, wombs closing, breath withdrawing. The statue was then baked in a furnace. For hours, nothing could be heard over the chanting. Then the screaming began. As the clay hardened, the space shrank. Zimrani's skin fused with the inner walls. When they pulled the statue from the flames days later, they did not break it. They placed it in the garden of the temple, standing silent, forever gestating pain. It remains there still, partially buried in sand. Locals say if you press your ear to the belly, you'll hear someone still breathing. In the cradle of ancient Greece, beneath the glory of Athens and the shadow of the Acropolis, certain punishments were never recorded in scrolls, only in whispers between philosophers. One such method, reserved for those who defied the oracle, was called the Labyrinth Breath. A man named Thales, no relation to the famed philosopher, had entered the oracle at Delphi and spoken aloud the name of the next earthquake before it occurred. He claimed Apollo himself had revealed it in a dream. The priest declared it blasphemy by truth. For this, Thales was taken to the oldest part of the temple, below the Pythia's chamber, where ancient passageways led into a subterranean maze once used for rituals long abandoned. He was given a single candle and no guidance. What made the punishment unique was not the darkness, but the air. The passages had been specially carved with narrow vents and ducts. As one moved, the breath of movement would cause faint whistles and echoes, turning footsteps into ghostly moans, heartbeats into thunder. Inside, Thales began to hallucinate. Voices echoed from walls, repeating his prophecy backward, then forward, then in languages not known to Greece. The candle flickered. Then it went out. He was never seen again. Weeks later, a different man, blind, bald, and naked, was found at the temple gates. He had Thales' ring, but his tongue was gone, and he no longer remembered his own name. In the basalt temples of the Olmecs, who ruled before the Maya, before even written time, there existed a punishment tied to the celestial clock. Known only as the star reversal, it was invoked when someone disrupted the sacred calendar. A child priest named Ixim defied the high astronomers, claiming the next eclipse would not come in 13 moons, but 9. When his prediction came true, fear spread, not of him, but of what he might be, for they believed he had stolen fire from the stars. His punishment was to be realigned. Ixim was bound to a stone disk representing the sun, then raised high above the central plaza of La Venta. Around him, 12 obsidian prisms were placed, each polished to reflect the stars in specific constellations. For 3 days, as the city celebrated the recalibration of heaven, the light of sun and moon was redirected onto his body in tight, concentrated beams. Each hour, a new part of him burned in the shape of a star. By the end of the ritual, his flesh bore the full Olmec zodiac, scarred into living skin. But it wasn't over. On the 4th night, the priests turned the mirrors to the sky, using Ixim as a living telescope, projecting pain upward like a beacon. The next morning, he was gone. Not missing. Gone. The disc was empty, the ropes uncut, and the ground beneath undisturbed. Some claim he was taken into the stars to replace what he had misaligned. In the stone cities of early Ethiopia, in the kingdom of Aksum, law was bound to ancestry. To betray one's bloodline was to tear a hole in the chain of kings. For this, the priests of Azana employed a sentence known as the Blood Echo. A nobleman named Samir was convicted of forging a genealogy scroll, inserting his name among divine descendants. He wished to marry a priestess of the sun, whose bloodline was considered too pure for mortals. His punishment, to hear the voices of the dead he had impersonated. In the Valley of Names, where the bones of kings were buried with stone drums, Samir was sealed in a cave etched with spirals and sunbursts. The drums were placed around him, and the opening was covered with bronze. Inside, the heat rose. Each hour, the drums expanded with the warmth, releasing air from tiny slits, causing deep, rhythmic tones. Over days, the drums began to speak in patterns. Samir claimed they called him by false names, demanded truth, mocked his lineage. He tried to chant back. By the 7th day, he had ripped out his hair and scratched his false name into his own skin, then crossed it out again. When they opened the cave on the 10th day, he was alive, but no longer spoke any human tongue. The drums, however, kept echoing for 30 nights after his removal. In the lands of ancient Thrace, where warriors painted themselves in ash and drank from the skulls of kings, there existed a punishment so feared that men whispered it only in dreams: the Hollow Feast. A chieftain named Brasis betrayed his tribe by selling their dead to Roman necromancers who paid handsomely for bones untainted by Christian rites. When discovered, the tribe demanded not justice, but reversal. They built a great table atop a burial mound, carved from oak and bone, polished with blood. Brasis was seated at the head, dressed in black linen, mouth sewn shut with wolf gut. Then, for 7 days, they fed him food from the graves he had desecrated. Rotten fruit left for the dead. Salted eyes, bread baked with ashes, wine soaked in teeth. He could not eat, but the scent alone drove him mad. Each day, a piece of his body was added to the table, a tooth, a finger, a tongue. On the seventh day, the tribe said farewell and left him seated. 1 year later, when Roman merchants passed the mound, they found the table still intact. Brasus was still there, smiling but not breathing. One account describes a man who lasted 17 days inside the boat, finally succumbing not to injury, but to total systemic collapse. When the Persians finally opened the top, his body was unrecognizable, alive no more but for days, the center of a buzzing, crawling ecosystem. Scaffism was not only a punishment, it was a public message, a warning louder than words. For the Persians, it said, "Betray us, and you will be erased not by sword, but by the slow appetite of nature itself." The next chapter of brutal ingenuity came from the Assyrians, a civilization that relished not only domination, but the display of its power through unimaginable torment. Their reign of terror was etched into stone reliefs, not as warnings, but as proud monuments of what befell their enemies. The Assyrian army, arguably the most feared in ancient Mesopotamia, was a machine of conquest, but it was their methods of punishment that truly chilled the blood. One of the most horrific punishments they employed was flaying, the removal of skin from a living person. Captured rebels or enemy leaders were often tied to large wooden posts, sometimes at the gates of conquered cities, and their skin was peeled from their backs in long, bloody ribbons. The process could take hours, as the executioners were trained to keep the victim alive and screaming for as long as possible. The flayed skin was then nailed to the city walls, a grotesque banner declaring Assyrian dominance. To the Assyrians, it wasn't just a sentence, it was a message to the world. Obedience meant survival. Rebellion meant pain beyond comprehension. But flaying was not the end. In some cases, prisoners were buried up to their necks in the scorching sands of the desert. With only their heads exposed, they were left under the blistering sun for days, their lips cracking, eyes burning, and minds unraveling in the heat. Scorpions and biting ants were often encouraged to approach, completing the torture as nature itself became the executioner. Assyrian kings, such as Ashurbanipal and Tiglath-Pileser III, documented these punishments proudly. They believed fear was the most efficient form of control, and through fear, they built an empire that echoed with the cries of the tormented. It is said that even centuries after their empire fell, travelers would whisper stories of Assyrian cruelty as cautionary tales by the fire. Now let us drift westward toward the heart of classical civilization, Greece. Known for philosophy, democracy, and art, ancient Greece also carried within its golden halls a shadow of retribution. Though many Greek punishments were rooted in legal and philosophical frameworks, there were moments when vengeance eclipsed logic. One of the most infamous Greek punishments was reserved for traitors and those who committed parricide, the murder of one's own parent. In Athens, such individuals were sewn into a sack alongside poisonous snakes, roosters, and even dogs, and then thrown into the sea or left to perish in isolation. This method, called the cruelest, was designed not only to kill, but to curse. The violent struggle inside the sack was symbolic, a chaotic dance of nature and sin, ending in death far from the human world. Yet even more disturbing was the story of Phalaris, a Greek tyrant of Akragas in Sicily. Phalaris commissioned a unique device from a skilled bronze worker, a hollow bronze bull large enough to fit a man inside. The bull was cast with acoustic tubes that would transform the screams of the victim into the sound of a bellowing animal. The condemned was placed inside and a fire was lit beneath the bull's belly, roasting them alive. The smoke would rise from the nostrils of the bull as if it were breathing. The first man to be tested in the bull, legend says, was the very craftsman who designed it, betrayed by the tyrant's cruelty. The Brazen Bull, as it came to be known, became a symbol of monstrous punishment disguised in artistry. Even in death, it told a story, one that blended pain, spectacle, and irony. Travelers who passed through Akragas spoke in hushed tones about the screams from the bronze beast and how they lingered in the winds like ghosts trapped in metal. Moving into the Roman world, the intensity of punishment did not lessen. If anything, Rome refined cruelty into a public affair. Punishments were not simply carried out, they were performed. Public executions in the Colosseum were theatrical experiences. Criminals, prisoners of war, and slaves were often thrown into the arena to face wild beasts in the event known as damnatio ad bestias. Lions, leopards, and bears were starved before the events, making their attacks immediate and ferocious. Sometimes the condemned were tied to stakes or dressed in animal skins to entice the beasts. Children would sometimes be in the audience, taught from a young age that Roman justice was swift, brutal, and inescapable. But the Romans also engineered psychological punishment. Crucifixion, perhaps the most infamous of all, was not originally their invention. It came from the Carthaginians, but Rome perfected it. Crucifixion was meant to humiliate, drawn out over days. The condemned would carry the crossbeam of their cross through the streets, a public symbol of shame. They were stripped naked, beaten, and then nailed to the wooden structure, not just through the palms, as is often depicted, but also through the wrists and ankles to prolong death. As the body sagged, breathing became impossible. Insects and birds would feast on the wounds. Death came not as a blow, but as a long, excruciating fade. Perhaps one of the darkest examples of Roman cruelty was poena culae, similar to the Greek method but even more elaborate. For parricide, the Romans would sew the criminal into a leather sack with a dog, a monkey, a rooster, and a viper, each symbolizing elements of chaos, and then throw the sack into a river. The confined space erupted into frantic violence as the animals attacked the human inside, all trapped in a floating prison of panic. The Romans believed this chaos mirrored the crime, a betrayal of blood, punished with madness. Even the noble and educated were not spared Roman cruelty. The philosopher Seneca, under orders from Emperor Nero, was forced to commit suicide. Forbidden to simply die, he opened his veins in a warm bath and bled slowly while giving one last stoic lecture. Nero's Rome was not merely an empire, it was a stage, and on that stage, pain was part of the performance. To the north, among the windswept forests and icy rivers, the Celts and Germanic tribes had their own methods of punishment, raw and primal, yet no less terrifying. While lacking the architectural theaters of Rome, their punishments were rooted in ritual and fear of the gods. Druids, the spiritual leaders of Celtic tribes, were believed to conduct human sacrifices to appease deities or predict future battles. Victims were sometimes burned in giant wooden structures known as wicker men, a towering effigy filled with humans and animals. Fire would consume the structure, flames licking the sky, believed to carry the souls upward as offerings. Roman accounts of these ceremonies vary in accuracy, but even exaggerated, the image is haunting. Entire families bound and screaming, watching the fire crawl toward them from inside a wooden titan. Among the Germanic tribes, disloyalty or cowardice was punished with exile, a fate worse than death. To be cast out of the tribe meant isolation in harsh terrain, starvation, and slow death by elements or beasts. In rare cases, a dishonored man would be tied to a tree and left for nature to judge. Wild animals, frostbite, or madness would complete the sentence. The community would not speak of them again, as if they had never existed. In cultures where honor and memory were sacred, erasure was the ultimate punishment. As we move toward the Far East, China's ancient dynasties offer their own grim legacy. While known for philosophy, poetry, and innovation, ancient China also wielded terrifying forms of punishment, particularly during the Qin and Han dynasties. One of the most feared punishments was lingqi, the death by 1,000 cuts. The condemned was bound in a public square, and over the course of hours their body was slowly sliced apart, piece by piece. It began with the limbs, fingers, toes, ears, followed by deeper cuts to the flesh. The executioner was trained to keep the victim alive until the very end. Onlookers would sometimes be allowed to throw stones or insults, making it a spectacle of communal cruelty. Lingqi was reserved for treason or patricide, crimes viewed as attacks against the state or the soul. Records show that the final blow, often to the heart or neck, was considered a mercy. The body parts were sometimes displayed or sent to the family as a warning. The psychological torment of lingqi extended even after death, as Confucian beliefs in bodily integrity meant that mutilation prevented peace in the afterlife. And then there was kneeling torture, a seemingly simple act with devastating results. Prisoners were forced to kneel on sharp, uneven surfaces, broken tiles, sharp stones, or even iron beads for hours or days. Muscles would cramp, skin would split, and blood would pool beneath them. It was not fatal, but it broke the will. In some cases, prisoners begged for death rather than endure the slow, degrading agony.